Okay, so to get us started, one of, I think, the interesting things that Mark raised in his keynote, and maybe this is my confirmation bias as a psychologist, Mark, but this idea of people making decisions about whether they trust organizations or information quickly and not necessarily sort of weighing up the pros and cons. To what extent do you think that people are aware of the privacy and trust issues when they're interacting with organizations or interacting with information? Do you want to start, Paul?
Sure. I think people are becoming much more aware, and in light of recent data breaches, some of the points Mark touched upon about when you see how people take responsibility over their business model and people's data and privacy, the revelations from the likes of Edward Snowden and so on in 2014 and so on, that people are becoming much more aware that they've been almost conned into becoming the product for these corporations that have no respect for their privacy. And I think that they're coming to understand what the value is to be able to trust and understand what trust is now. I mean, I think we've moved on from the Mark Zuckerberg of privacy is dead. This is a man who believes in privacy so much that he bought all the houses around his own home so that he has privacy, but the rest of us don't if we use his products and services. So I think there is an awakening. I think, as Mark talked about, that there is this adjustment going on, and it's welcome, because I think people are really realizing that this is something they don't want to give away. We have a human right to privacy within this country, but I think culturally we've become almost digitally colonized by taking on the technology of the United States of America that don't have a human right to privacy.
Okay. Val?
Well, I think there's two elements. One is consumers, and then one is organizations. So who's aware? In consumers, awareness is changing. There's no two ways about it. Things such as regulation are bringing about that change. But ultimately, looking around the room at particular age profiles, we know that sort of the generations that fall between 15, 25 and 30 at the moment would be significantly more privacy aware than, say, the baby boomers. So there is a level of privacy awareness, but then those same individuals may be less pragmatic about who they share data with, where the boomers will share with nobody. So the awareness, I think, exists in certain cases. I think that certain nations are more aware as well. Certain regulations will make consumers more aware. And I think it also depends on, again, back to nations, but organizations are actually making their consumers more aware. So if you look at practices, say, for instance, in Apple at the moment, Apple have a center online where you can go and you can essentially ask them questions about your privacy protection in their organization, and you can make settings and change settings. So some organizations are encouraging consumers to be more privacy aware as well.
I think, there's a lot of studies you can see about marketplace behavior that will tell you, for example, that the rise of Snapchat was all about teenagers knowing that they didn't want their photographs to last more than 24 hours. What was the response? What was the reason for that? Well, because this new generation, my daughter's 13, I mean, she is so much more aware of people trying to take advantage of her. She's more aware of her privacy than any generation before. And I think that's a market-driven awareness. I think it just comes down to people's lives. Like, for example, how many of us in the room have been tracked by an ad for a holiday you took last year? And you get tracked by it, and you're like, why does this keep coming back to me? Well, because there's someone sitting on your shoulder, 35 or 40 on average trackers, every time you open a website page. Used to be you didn't know about them, but now we're starting to wise up. Oh, that's why. Because I am being surveyed every day, every moment of my day. And it just takes one moment of a bad advertising experience, one moment when your data is exposed, as in obviously Cambridge Analytica, and there's kind of the scales fall from people's eyes. And it's those individual light bulb moments that are happening more and more that are leading behavioral change toward things like ad blocker, people changing their privacy settings. I'm sure every single person in this room knows exactly how to adjust privacy settings. I guarantee you 10 years ago, that wasn't something that was common knowledge. So it's a great thing that's happening, but it's also been inspired by, I think, a terrible, terrible manipulative relationship between businesses, the big ones like Silicon Valley, as Paul says, who had a different philosophy, and these moments of individual awakening. it can't come too soon, to be quite honest.
Something that's come up on the two previous panels this afternoon is universities' responsibility in equipping people to deal with the future of work or with digital transformation and giving people skills to do that. Where does the responsibility or the duty lie around privacy and education in that? Does it lie with universities, or does it lie with governments or with organisations themselves? What's your view on where the responsibility lies?
I'll take that if you like. I mean, we see this a lot in the world of cybersecurity. If you look at Israel, they have one of the fastest growing and strongest forces, if you like, in the world of cybersecurity. And that's because they essentially groom children to go into the world of cybersecurity, then conscript them into the army. So by the time they're coming out into the industry of cybersecurity at 22, 23, they're the best in the world. But what they don't teach them is ethics and morality. So they teach them power on how to do certain things, but not ethics. So I think it's something, and we've talked about morality and ethics on this stage a few weeks ago, because we think, it's one of the most important concepts that needs to be taught in relation to digital transformation. Artificial intelligence is not artificial wisdom. We're at this cusp of using technology and so on, and I'm a technologist, I'm an entrepreneur, it's all about using this, but understanding that there has to be ethics involved, and that has to be taught based on, ethics are essentially rules, it's your rule base, and the morality is how you're going to apply that to whatever technology that you have on. And last night I was talking at something which is a threat to privacy here in Ireland as well, which is Brexit. People say, well, why would this? I mean, from March 30th, it's going to be illegal to transfer private data to the UK unless something miraculously happens. But one of the things they're going to use to get us to perhaps jump on board that is fear. And the fear of the unknown, the fear of what will happen to our economy and everything else unless we do something about this. And that may be when they apply different legislation, different regulations, and different technology, exactly like they did after 9/11 with the US Patriot Act. That's a bullet that leaves a gun, that's a genie that's left the bottle. Very hard to put back in. You end up doing a deal with the devil. So I think there has to be that morality issue on the table at all times when we're talking about this kind of technology, this kind of power and transformational things to people's lives.
I think on the question on whose responsibility is it, I think it's a collective responsibility. You cannot turn around and say, oh, governments have failed if a piece of legislation doesn't exist. Everybody has an element of being able to protect their own information. Organisations, as Mark has said, have done bad stuff, if you want to call it that, in the past, and regulation can help. It's certainly not the be-all and end-all, but it can help to resolve those issues. Lobbying, advocacy, there's a whole series of other elements as well that can help to protect privacy. I also think, personally, as an individual, I suppose because I'm both academic in a background and I work in the space, I take my knowledge to local secondary schools, and we all have a responsibility to share our knowledge. So those teenagers who are 17, 18, they don't know their rights under GDPR, and it's incumbent on those of us, I believe, who do, to share that responsibility and to bring that knowledge to them. I think GDPR as a piece of legislation, I know I work with it, but I happen to think it's an incredibly powerful piece of legislation. I think it's also bringing responsibility to organisations and to consumers. So I think it's everybody's responsibility.
I think we just got to stop talking about it the same way we talk about like eating your broccoli. You've got to protect yourself. Oh my God, you all got to get more conscious and aware. And the internet's eating our children. I just stop that. Look at the opportunities, right? To teach our children from a very early age things like information literacy. To know that when you see friends and family on Facebook, that's not your friends and family. That's an algorithm. It's a computer machine written to allow you to see things and feel like it's coming from your friends and family. When you understand these things, the power and the great feeling of consciousness is something I always try to preach to people. The power that comes by being aware of your world, that comes from media literacy, information literacy, telling your kids how they're not going to be fooled the way previous generations are, that's a positive. The second positive will be starting to look at ethical leadership, not management. We teach too much management, i.e., how do you make people think you're in control? We don't teach enough leadership. How do you tell other people they're in control and give them the power to take that control in reality? So, for example, there's a great opportunity to rewrite the algorithms that underpin our society's information systems. I don't know if you've seen The Big Short, the movie, right? There's a moment where Steve Carell realizes that nobody knows how the financial products work that are powering the international economy. And it's just before the shit hits the fan. We're in that moment with information. Nobody knows how the Facebook algorithm works anymore, even Facebook. So there's a great opportunity for people to step in. The work that Paul's doing, the work hopefully that the machine learning people working with me are doing is rewrite the biases out of these systems and bring human empowerment back in. That's an amazing opportunity for smart business leaders. And finally, I think the opportunity that comes with things like diversity of viewpoint, the idea of building businesses on the basis of sort of awareness and consciousness of being your competitive advantage, and reaching out to new parts of the market that were denied to you because you thought about business in a very old style, I have the power, you don't, buy from me. That way of doing business is old, it's dying. And unless you can find a new way of doing business, I think you'll lose a competitive advantage that you could have. So I take the positives. This is a great moment to be facing these challenges because consciousness raising about privacy, security, trust is the building blocks of the next generation of successful businesses. Forget Silicon Valley. Do almost everything that they did in the past 10 years and do the opposite. And I think you found a fairly good business plan.
Thanks. Valerie, you mentioned GDPR, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your view on how changing regulation is influencing organisational privacy practices, and how that might interact with trust and build the kind of trust that Mark is talking about.
Well, a couple of different ways. First of all, we know there's a correlation from various different studies, academic studies, between privacy and trust. So there was a study done in 2009 by a scholar called Sue, and that basically it resulted in findings that showed where we can demonstrate trustworthy behaviours about privacy protection. So that is that we as an organisation can demonstrate that we can protect privacy information and we can keep information and the integrity of it, we can keep it accurate. If we can do that and show that we're benevolent, it's benevolent towards the data subject, and do it repeatedly, consistently over a period of time, then the findings were that privacy incidents decrease and trust increases. So that's the academic side, and so we know there's a correlation between privacy, trust, and privacy incidents. In the practical world, in GDPR, we know that there's a number of different things in GDPR that are aimed intentionally at enhancing trust. Edelman, as Mark pointed out, the Edelman barometer had a number of years ago highlighted a decrease in consumer trust across Europe, and it's one of the reasons, one of the things that motivated the development of this piece of legislation. So we can now see that consumer trust is increasing. Can we say it's directly as a result of GDPR? Well, we can see that it's increasing at a greater rate in Europe since GDPR than it is in the US. So what are the differentiators there? Well, we know that there is a piece of legislation. But what's enshrined in GDPR, which I think is the most interesting piece, are a number of different factors that do help to increase consumer trust and help to create a more private culture. And one of the main ones are mandatory disclosure. So every time an organisation has a breach, they have to disclose it. So in the past, the only window that we had into bad stuff, the things that organisations were doing that weren't good, the only window we had was a breach, when they did bad stuff and it got reported in the media. Now we actually see it before it gets reported in the media, because now we'll have it in a database that we can take a look at, as some organisations already have in the States. We also have transparency, forced transparency, so you will notice that all those terms and conditions that we've had in the past, pages and pages and pages of documents, that's all changed. We now need to have much more clear privacy statements so that consumers can understand them. And we also have another principle, which is a really important principle that most of us won't feel yet, but it's definitely going to be seen, which is the principle of proportionality. In other words, in the past, organizations, just because they could do it, did it. And Facebook, Cambridge Analytica is a really, really good example of that. And regulation only brings you a certain way to get to a level of trust. The principle of proportionality, and it's only in GDPR, it's not in any US piece of legislation, says just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. And that's a really, really important part of the legislation that really will enhance consumer trust. Now, we don't know what it really looks like yet because we have no case law, so we don't know how it's going to be fought in court, but the principle exists. So in the case of Cambridge Analytica, I believe, first of all, their fines would have been enormous. 500,000 was what they were charged. Under GDPR, it would have been, I think, 225 million, some crazy number. The breach was pre-GDPR, unfortunately. So I think there's many different aspects. I think also from the consumer's perspective, they have a number of data rights that they didn't have before. So if everybody in this room doesn't know their 6 data subject rights, you should really go out and read the GDPR because you have 6 hugely powerful rights that you never had before. And the most important one of those is free access to your data. You can make a subject access request for free now. You used to have to pay €6.35 before. I know it's not much, but it was a deterrent. It was £5 for those of you who go back far enough, converted to €6.35 in the euro. But that's gone now, so you can make a subject access request, and someone like me has been making subject access requests ad nauseum since the 25th of May, and it's incredibly powerful. And so this is what's creating increased consumer trust, I believe.
And it's changing the way we design products already. Like I know in my case, in our business, we have a personal API that is all your data, talks to a news API that's all the content. In the old days, it would have been mixed together, and that's how data leaked away. The second part is I only accept what I need from you, which is maybe your location to give you local news, or your profession to give you professional news, but nothing else. And now the next stage is, what happens if we could build you a little vault, a key, lock up all your data, and literally go around offering it up, saying, hey, do you want to see my data about my preferences? Well, I'll sell that to you for a service or a discount or possibly even some sort of token. So the idea is, I love, and Tim Berners-Lee's working on a fantastic project at the moment around the idea of a personal data vault, which is your key essentially that opens up all kinds of experiences. And consumers, you know, as a consumer, you've got all the power. Your data is actually a monetizable asset that you control. That, I think, is going to be an incredible departure. And thanks to GDPR, which made us all sit up and go, oh, times have changed. So it's already working itself through to product development and commercial opportunities. And again, as I say, to a competitive advantage for those who take it seriously.
And Paul, as a cybersecurity...
Yeah, I mean, this is like probably one of the best principles of this is baking it in, not bolting it on. And I think we need to look at this in business models. The cost of goods sold, you have to have a line item there called privacy. You have to have one for security and so on. And I think GDPR is beyond Europe. It's an international, if you like, framework, and it's a catalyst, a wake-up call that people can understand their principles involved in that and say, well, if I'm looking at any product or services, are they taking my data seriously? Are they going to take my rights seriously? Do I trust them? This word trust is what it's all key about. It's so easy to define the other words like, you know, even privacy or governance, but the word trust, because it's based back to your limbic brain, what you trust and what you don't trust. I mean, you can have 2 siblings brought up in the same environment, same parents, same DNA, pretty much everything else like that. They're queuing up in Funderland. One will get on the roller coaster, one won't, because they trust it and the other one doesn't. It's exactly the same with the online experience. And trying to codify that or trying to create an algorithm to establish trust is very, very difficult. And it involves this marriage between the cyber world and the real kinetic world, and the principles of what we're going to trust when we experience an app or a website or a brand or a logo, and that's the key, I think, and that's why I was like sort of leading forward when Marcus was saying that's exactly it. I mean, you know, being able to trust information. You know, this whole thing with Donald Trump and attack on media and where the world is going as a consequence of this is what's real, what's not real anymore. So there's a bigger mission here around privacy and around the integrity of news and everything else like that. It's a bigger mission for society, more so than anything else, more so than a commercial model, I think. And it's very important to get it right. And I think it goes beyond just the baseline privacy things of GDPR, because they are pretty baseline. Securing something is a lot different from keeping it private. And sometimes that's a slightly different mission about keeping it, especially in relation to, Valerie mentioned there about mandatory breach notification. Well, in parallel with the GDPR coming in came the Network Information Systems Directive, which also has mandatory breach notification, also has massive fines associated with it. But it's about keeping our information society secure. So Europe is now looking at this as we're all part of an information society beyond critical national infrastructure. It's what's making up our everyday life on the internet. That is what is critical to life, and that's what legislation is now there for, to protect, that essentially our internet cyber lives are being protected as well, as much as roads, bridges, electricity, utilities, water, and all of those things as well.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned those individual differences in whether somebody's likely to trust or not, because something that's starting to happen in the psychology literature is a recognition that those individual differences maybe aren't quite as stable as we thought. So previously we would have thought that, you know, you reach the end of your childhood and you're sort of stuck with whatever level of trusting or cynicism that you have. But what we're starting to realize is that people's life experiences actually play a really big role in that. And it hasn't been researched yet, but I would assume then your experiences in terms of privacy and dealing with businesses in a digital environment would then influence how you are likely to trust digital business in general then as you move forward after that. So if you've got a really meaningful interaction that makes an impression on you, whether it's positive or negative, that would influence your general perception.
Yeah, I think there's a number of factors and they're cumulative. So you can establish and build trust with a brand online and you've a good experience, therefore you will trust it more and so on. But I think there's also parallels with, you know, those sort of phrases where, you know, a person that wears their heart on their sleeve or easily trusts and so on. The ultimate trust is love, you know, makes the ultimate vulnerability. So I'm not saying we all fall in love online, but when you love a brand or you start trusting a brand and everything else like that, that's where those emotions come from. That's, Mark talked about it there on Facebook. They play in your emotions. You happy, sad, all of those things, and that's how they're so successful. And that emotional trust at a deep level that people should have with a brand beyond the technology. It might have the best app in the world and one maybe not so good, but people trust that brand, the people behind it, the humans behind it, the messaging, the sentiment, the integrity of everything they're saying, because the founders are on the front of a stage and you can feel their passion for it, as opposed to somebody who's just hired to walk out and talk about a product. That's the difference. Now, describe that, codify that. You can't, that's human.
And I think that's one of the dangers we have, is that we'll see, as the media are doing at the moment, you know, the media's failure, by the way, is a big reason for Donald Trump's rise. Yeah. Media doesn't feel real anymore, right? Does it feel like, you know, people don't divide their lives into news, sport, politics, business. Like, news used to be a certain way, and I think we betrayed people. So that was part of the reason for distrust in media. And now we see media coming back and say, democracy dies in darkness, or the facts matter. You know, if you went to a supermarket and they said to you, we won't poison you with bad food, how would you feel about it, right? The media keep playing on these old ideas, when in fact what people are demanding is, I think benevolence you mentioned, this idea, we have your best interests at heart. We're going to offer you problems, but also solutions. We're not going to discuss politics like sport. We're going to see what issues are actually changing your life. If we in the media would start understanding that the crisis of trust in journalism is not about Donald Trump, it's about our own failures to connect to individuals, we will go a long way to restoring that trust. So it's not about, you know, democracy dies in darkness. It's about people are being blinded with all these choices. And journalism has got to get back into their individual lives again and stop pretending that the problem here is they're not, you know, fact-checking. It's not fact-checking. The problem we have with trust in journalism and information generally is not the supply of bad information, it's the demand for bad information, i.e., why do people accept this stuff? Well, it's because sometimes a politician like Donald Trump feels more authentic than a journalist. And that's a problem that we've got to get over, and we won't do it by trying to reassure people that the information here is safe. That's a given. We have to be at least at that point and beyond it. So I think you'll hear a lot more about the phrase user experience. How do we get into your life in a way that makes me feel very connected to you, as opposed to seeing a journalist or an information giver as someone in an exalted position of authority. That's the old days. I think they're gone. We've got to be thinking about user experience as being the vital component of trust.
Okay. Thank you all so much for your contribution. I think Mary here is indicating that we're out of time. And thank you all for listening as well.